All right, we're back. It's another Carolina podcast, back on schedule, recording on Wednesday of this week after recording a little bit early last week. And I didn't think that it would be a big deal, but as it turns out, we did miss a recruit that came down Wednesday, but that just gives us one more bit of recruiting news to talk about today, as it has been a very, very busy week for South Carolina. And it was funny because in the last couple of weeks, the three of us have talked about what the recruiting, what would happen on the recruiting trail now that players were reporting back to campus. And obviously, coaches are still not allowed to be involved with the exception of strength and conditioning coaches. So maybe I was a little bit premature in anticipating that there would be a little bit of a dip, or rather a sort of a resume to normalcy in terms of, I guess, this being a relatively quiet recruiting period. But it's been very busy for South Carolina. Since last we spoke, Carolina has gotten 3 more commits. And as we've done for the last couple weeks, I guess ever since Will Muschamp's teleconference on that Monday when everybody reported, we're going to dig into whether or not this is a real commitment or whether or not this is what Will Muschamp has been calling a reservation, since this is such an interesting time for recruiting. But we'll go ahead and get started with the guy that committed South Carolina last Wednesday. Again, we just missed it because we recorded the podcast early last week. But Wes, tell me about Jordan Davis, what kind of player Carolina gets with him, and what his recruitment was like.
Yeah, well, we'll start with what the recruitment is like, I guess. We recorded last Tuesday. We were talking about how Carolina had a Spurs up from Monday that had not been revealed, and that was actually Jordan Davis, 3-star offensive lineman. He actually landed an offer from South Carolina on Monday and, last Monday, and obviously quickly accepted it. I guess wanted to maybe get a graphic ready or just sort of get everything in order on his end and, before he put it out, which is pretty common with prospects. And, a kid that obviously just wanted to jump in the boat once he had the offer, someone that South Carolina, I think, is obviously high on, and someone that they've already got a kid from there, Jordan Rhodes, who's a redshirt junior, obviously on the current team, started 10 games last year, and I think there are some similarities to where they are maybe as prospects right now, but obviously at the time was the first offensive line commitment for South Carolina, and sort of got the ball rolling on the class there. So, Chris, you want to talk a little about Jordan as a player?
Sure. I mean, so, Jordan, and I think you made a good point in making the similarity to the other Jordan from Creekside High School in Jordan Rhodes, and that, both guys coming out of high school were a little raw. Jordan Rhodes mainly because he had not played football for that long. Jordan Davis is just a guy that, you talk to coaches around that area or coaches that have seen him play, even coaches within that Creekside program, you get a lot of the same adjectives to describe him, a lot of the same descriptors, and that is, he's a big kid who can move his feet. He's got a lot of potential as a tackle, but he's also sort of raw. And look, when you look at what South Carolina has coming back, particularly at tackle, they got some younger guys, they got some older guys, and so, they've been able to address both of those and bring in some guys in that, like a Justin Turnitine in last class who could come in, step in, play immediately. Then we saw that with Dennis Daly, who, came in and was able to make an impact, but also some guys who played as freshmen, Ja'Kai Moore, Dylan Wanham, Jalen Nichols. I think Jordan Davis is a guy that will take a little while to develop, but you also have some time because of the depth that they built up at tackle. You probably got some time to develop them too. So, again, a little bit raw, but you look at the canvas that he brings as a player that Eric Wolford can sort of mold. He can refine the technique. He can probably, pull some more aggression out of him. That's one thing that an area coach told me, like to see him be a little bit more aggressive. But when you look at just the baseline of what he can do in terms of movement ability, there's a lot to like there.
When you look at a recruitment like this, as you mentioned, Wes, it all sort of happened very quickly. Obviously, we've talked ad nauseum about how unusual this year is in terms of the recruiting cycle and the early commitments and things like that. But in general, when you see guys commit like very soon after getting an offer, does that tend to indicate that this is maybe where this kid always wanted to play, or that he feels like this is like already going to be a great fit? Or do you see a higher rate of people that commit very quickly after receiving an offer later decommitting?
Yeah, I think it all depends on the kid, and it depends on the timeline as well. I think generally, if it's really, really early, if you're talking about like a high school sophomore or high school, like rising junior that's going into his junior year, and his first big offer and a kid commits, generally that sort of says to me, like, okay, this is basically like this is the kid's leader right now, really, as opposed to a true commitment. That's obviously not the case with Jordan Davis. You're talking about somebody going into their senior year. I think there was maybe a situation where he was probably familiar with South Carolina a little bit from Jordan Rhodes being there. And, in this case, I think the fact that he jumped on the offer means that, he was obviously high on South Carolina. And, something else I think worth mentioning is that, he was a kid South Carolina had obviously been monitoring for a while and really fits in the category of these guys that just haven't been able to make it to a lot of schools, obviously haven't been able to camp. He's someone, like Chris talked about, when you look at the canvas here, anytime you have a big athletic kid like that, the next step is really just to monitor them, stay in touch, and then get them in camp. And obviously that was not possible in this case. And in the case of Jordan Davis, South Carolina actually they got some type of fresh tape on him. I don't know if it was another cut from last year or just maybe some video of him working out, recently, showing movement ability. I'm not sure the details, but they got some fresh tape on him, and he's put on some weight, really from what I was told, some good weight, 6'5", 290 now, is a long-armed kid, and really the only Power 5 school that he's even visited is Georgia Tech. And when Georgia Tech had him on campus and saw him in person, they offered immediately as well. So it really just fits that mold like we've been talking about as a kid who really could have potentially landed some more offers if he had been able to get to camps. But, schools just had to sort of gather as much information and then go, and go or pass, really. And South Carolina decided to go on him, obviously. And I think, I've talked about this probably on the 107.5 show. If you have, unless it's just a 5-star, no-brainer, just obvious, like 6'5", 300-pound kid that's fully developed, there's only a handful of those guys in the country every year. You kind of have to take a trade-off, and it's either going to be a guy that's not quite as athletic but is technically sound, is already developed, is sort of closer to a finished project, or someone that's raw but athletic and has the physical tools where you think you can develop them. That doesn't mean it's not always going to turn out in either of those scenarios. Maybe the guy you take that's technically sound just isn't athletic enough to stand up against SEC competition. Maybe Jordan Davis either does or does not develop into an SEC starter. But we've seen, if you want to talk about trends, we've seen Eric Wolford lean towards taking the guys who, like Chris said, are blank canvas and are athletic enough to fit what you're looking for. And then you just have to take enough of those guys and develop enough of them that it works out for you.
And I think Eric Wolford has a good enough track record that, for all the Carolina fans right now that are, moaning about all the 3-stars that Carolina has gotten commitments from lately, and I'll ask you more about that later just in sort of a bigger picture kind of way, but I feel like you just kind of have to trust Eric Wolford. Chris, I'll bounce this back to you for a quick tangent because you and Wes said something that was interesting to me last year, that oftentimes defensive backs are sort of the last guys to emerge in recruiting classes because it's, like harder to break down. I think that was what you said, or just in terms of the guys that are late bloomers, like those are the guys that you normally get later in the classes that you're going to wait till their senior year and things like that to make a decision on. It feels like offensive linemen would also be in that category, and especially given what's going on right now, is this going to be an uncharacteristically difficult offensive line class? Because I imagine most of those guys fit into that category of mostly late bloomers as well. Especially, even once guys get on campus, it's the highest percentage probably of any position group of guys that redshirt that need that time to get ready physically. So is this just going to be a lot of guys taking chances on like relatively unknown commodities?
So I'll break that down in two parts. So the first one about, the positionally when and which one's most difficult and why we sort of what I think you're referencing that we said about defensive backs is just sort of, as far as South Carolina in particular, they really like to see defensive backs in camp, if possible, in a camp setting. Now, they offer guys early, et cetera, and some guys commit early, but they really like to see those guys in camp. And, heck, even last summer, O'Donnell Fortune and Joey Hunter were both guys that earned offers in camp after South Carolina saw them. They knew, but it's not like they got to camp and South Carolina said, I've never heard of this guy. They obviously knew, who those guys were, but they just wanted to run them through the testing ringer. They wanted to, see how they were coachable. They wanted to see, how could they move. And Will Muschamp's talked about this a lot. It's difficult sometimes to get a read for a DB on tape. Now, sometimes you can see some things, how he can turn his hips and what type of ball skills he has. Is he dangerous after, he picks the ball off? Can he run? Is he physical? You can see some things, but sometimes the tape can lie or the tape's difficult. And so you really want to get a feel for those guys in person. And it can be the same with offensive linemen with bad tape, or just sort of tough to get a feel for how he can move, what's going on there in the trenches. So, linemen, look, you want to have every possible player in camp, because I could talk about any position. I could say, okay, this quarterback, I want to see him in camp. I want to see how he throws and how he's coachable. I want to see, a receiver in camp, to test him. And you can apply those to any position. And South Carolina applies it to every position. They want to see as many guys as possible in camp, and that's the case at most schools, if not all of them. But, this class, look, it's more of a challenge in general, and just because you don't have the spring evaluation period, you don't have summer camps, you don't have those typical evaluation tools, and we'll see what this season looks like as far as, is South Carolina going to be able to say, go out on the road and watch some guys in games? We just don't know yet if that'll happen or when. This offensive line class is going to be a small one. Right now, technically, they're at their allotment. They wanted to take 2 guys in this class. They've got both of those guys now with Davis and Darius Morgan. Could the staff take another? It is still possible, but it just depends. So I wouldn't say it's challenging in the sense that you don't have those tools, camp and eval period, all that, but that applies to every position. I think it's just more of they were able to go ahead and hit their allotment for this class, which is a good thing if it's 2 guys they like.
Well, we'll stick with the offensive line class because the next guy I want to talk about, and Chris, I'll let you take this one since Wes took Jordan Davis, another offensive lineman. I don't know if this just necessarily means he's a little more ready or a little bit less of a project, but Darius Morgan, 6'4", already listed at 306 pounds, so has about 15 pounds on Davis from Birmingham, Alabama. Walk me through his recruitment and what kind of player South Carolina's getting.
So South Carolina actually offered Morgan, I think, earlier this spring. It wasn't too long ago, but they've actually had an offer out to him for a while. And really in the past few weeks, he sort of behind the scenes became a guy that South Carolina really wanted. Obviously, when you think about the fact that they were looking at taking 2 in this class, and then that narrowed even further right after Davis committed, then you had 1 spot, 2 at the absolute most. Your board is already narrow going into the cycle, and it continues to narrow over time, whether it's guys committing elsewhere, you get more info on guys, or you offer new guys. And so as all that was happening, South Carolina, Wolford really zeroed in on Morgan as the guy it wanted as a second offensive lineman in this class, out of sort of that pool, and we're able to get him in the boat. And we talked about this last week, I think, and that there was, not that you pressure a guy, but there now became a little bit of a squeeze, right? Where if you want in, to occupy that second spot, you do it. And so, that's sort of how it played out in terms of, Wolford really liking him, really zeroing in on him behind the scenes. And there's a lot to like about him as a player as well.
All right. So Wes, he's got a few more offers, a little more interest from some of the other Power 5 schools, Arizona State, Georgia Tech again, Louisville in the mix. What's your projection for him as a player? Listed as an offensive tackle, but again, already has good size on him. Is he someone that you think would transition inside, play a little guard for Carolina, or is he a true tackle?
Yeah, I think he's one of those versatile guys that could do either. I talked to Darius right after he committed, and he said that the message he was being told was basically that he was someone that they liked his versatility, liked the fact that he could maybe do both, but that he was probably going to end up more as a guard at South Carolina. And I really think that's, for one, if you only take a 2-man class, then, like Chris said, it could be a 2-man class, could maybe grow to a 3-man class, but not expecting a huge class, then you probably want to take, maybe a guy who is a pure tackle, which I think that's what David is, and then maybe a guy who could do both. Most of the time, I think your tackles are going to be your more athletic prospects. So, in general, if a guy plays out there on the edge in high school, then, maybe you put a little weight on him and grow him into a guard and move him there when you get him. And I think that's probably the most likely case with John Darius Morgan. And, fits that mold, though. We've talked versatility, I think, is a trend in this class. We talked about Jaden Johnson, who committed last Monday, being someone who plays a number of positions. You look at Caleb McDowell, the running back commitment. He's someone that plays a lot of defensive back. Obviously, we'll get into Omega Blake here shortly. But really, versatility, ability to sort of move across, play different positions at a high level seems to be a trend with this class. And I think that's the case with Morgan. And really is the case with most South Carolina's offensive linemen. I think you see Wolford likes to cross-train guys between the two spots and likes guys. South Carolina uses that philosophy of you're not necessarily a direct backup, as in if you're the second-string left guard, that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to go in next if the left guard goes down. It's more a philosophy of who are our best five and then who's the sixth best and what's the best sort of combination of guys that gets, the next guy on the field if somebody gets hurt. So I think if you're going to take that approach to a game day, then obviously you need to take that approach to recruiting as well. And I think that they certainly do that.
Wes, you sort of anticipated my next question for Chris in terms of the cross-training. We know that Will Muschamp likes to cross-train his cornerbacks and safeties, and that gets talked about a lot, and it sounds like Wolford does the same kind of thing. So is that a Wolf-specific thing, or is that just a trend around college football right now?
I wouldn't say it's Wolf-specific because we do see at other programs, a guy, a swing guy who can go and play multiple spots if needed. Again, like Wes characterized it, trying to find that sixth guy. Like who's your sixth guy? Who's the first guy off the bench? Who's the first two or three guys off the bench? You hear them talk a lot in terms of, finding your best eight. You want to have 8 or 9 offensive linemen you feel good about, and that's not so you have, like Wes said, a backup at this spot, this spot. You find who's the best guy. Can he play multiple positions? And so we have seen that. Just as a quick example, just because it's the first one that came to my head, Alabama had some guys that, played, center or guard and tackle, just depending on if you had a guy go down with injury or if you're rotating a guy in and out. So I think some schools do that. Wolford certainly has, other schools rotate guys more. Clemson, for example, rotated offensive linemen a little bit more. Will South Carolina do that more in the future? Maybe, because they're starting to build up some depth, and so you feel like if you need to pull a guy to send a message, or maybe he's not having the best game, you can do that, or you can rotate some guys. I don't know, but he's typically stuck with more of a here's our 5, and he'll make a change if he needs to for performance reasons. So that'll be interesting, but I think it's not really South Carolina specific, but it is something that that Wolford certainly prides himself on in terms of from what we can tell on the recruiting trail in terms of just finding guys that can play a bunch of positions. Eric Douglas, for example, I think has in practice at least played every position on the team. I think he's worked at guard, he's worked at center, he's worked at tackle. So he looks for that in guys.
And it just seems like college football is heading in that direction, hybrid safety linebackers and guys playing, corner and safety. And you mentioned, Wes, a couple of guys, offensively. It's like, okay, well, this is a guy that can be a tight end or a wide receiver, or somebody that can do a little bit of everything a la, Pharaoh, a la Debo. You're a wide receiver, but we can do some running back kind of stuff with you. So it's all kind of trending towards versatility. But I guess I was just wondering if that had completely spilled over into offensive line, because it also does seem like there are some places, and maybe this is wrong, maybe this is just like perception, because I'm not behind the scenes as much with those other teams, but it seems like some places are like, all right, you're a tackle, and we're going to draft you. I guess kind of like Justin Turnitine. When you draft someone like that, there's no chance he's going to play guard or center. He's just a tackle, and I guess there just seems to be a little bit less of that now in general, and especially as you think about South Carolina. Because other than Justin, is there any guy right now in South Carolina's roster that's basically just one spot, that's basically just a tackle or a center or whatever?
Dylan Wanham has, I think, now he could play right or left, But there are a few guys. I mean, Jalen Nichols, the staff thought during recruiting could play guard, but I think he's mostly been tackle. Most of the centers, have gotten looks at guard, like Hank Manos, Vinny Murphy. Eric Douglas, I mentioned, has played really 4 or 5 spots. So there aren't many, I would say most of the guys on the roster have played. And Wes, you can correct me if I think I'm off on this, but I think to my recollection, like most of the guys on the roster have at least gotten a look at, a few spots or a couple of spots. But there are some that have mainly stayed outside or mainly stayed inside.
All right, well, speaking of versatility, another guy, and Wes, you already mentioned him, but Omega Blake. And also, just as a side note, before we talk a little bit more about Omega, South Carolina doing a really great job with guys with awesome names. We talked about the specialists coming in, I guess, in the class of 2020, and Kai Kroger and Mitch Jeter, or maybe they're counting for 2021. I don't know how that happens, but they're going to be on campus this year. You have Omega Blake, O'Donnell Fortune, Jerkari Caldwell. Carolina just really putting together like an all-world, like elite-level, awesome name football team, and Omega Blake is certainly going to vault to the top of that list, especially if his production can match how cool his name is. Another 3-star guy out of Rock Hill, so a local kid, South Point. Devontae Holloman's his coach. That's as good a segue as any into his recruitment, Wes, what it was like, how quickly this transpired, how quickly this came together, and what kind of player Carolina's getting.
Yeah, South Carolina obviously officially offered him about 2 weeks ago, and we're recording this on Wednesday, so it was 2 weeks ago on Monday, which is actually the day that Omega committed. So he committed 2 weeks to the day from getting the offer, and really, I think once South Carolina offered, unless there were some major changes as far as other offers go, that really sort of locked him in as being the pick. He's someone that they monitored for a while. They had him in camp last year. They've watched him, sort of develop, and really this is a situation where they were monitoring the academics as much as anything. We don't really go into much detail on stuff like that, but that was sort of the primary deal. He had a good year in the classroom this past year and was able to put himself in a good spot there, and South Carolina moved forward with the offer. And, this is a scenario where Alabama was asking around, Clemson was asking around, Georgia was asking around, and really much like South Carolina had been monitoring him closely as well. And, I think if one or two of those had offered, it would have at least made things interesting and maybe extended the recruitment out. But once South Carolina offered and those schools didn't quickly follow up, I think South Carolina, he called him the dream school for him. And if you look at sort of the timeline, when he was growing up, when he was a kid, Stephon Gilmore, Devontae Holloman, who's obviously his coach, like you said, Jadeveon Clowney, it was really the golden era of South Carolina football, and the guys leading the way, a lot of them were from right there at South Point where he's at right now. So I think just seeing the program then really put it in his mind as being where he wanted to end up.
Wes, we asked you this on our local show, on the halftime show with Jay Phillips yesterday, so I guess I'll toss this one to Chris to see if he has the exact same answer, as I imagine he will. But how much of a factor was it? Not that Devontae Holloman would have pushed him to go one way or the other, but just that relationship existed, and just that, as you mentioned, Wes, him growing up watching Holloman and then watching him at Carolina, how much of that do you think actually plays a part in this recruitment?
Well, it certainly didn't hurt. I mean, like you said, Devontae's a stand-up guy who's going to do the best for his kids and is not going to push a guy somewhere. But certainly Omega, Devontae's a guy that Omega can look up to because he played at South Point senior season, went to South Carolina, went to the NFL, unfortunately had his career cut short by that injury, but was doing well in the NFL. And so certainly there's some things he can look at and say that this guy did it. And he did it at South Carolina. And like Wes said, I think that's one reason, when he was coming up in his sort of formative years, watching those teams that Devontae played on and had a huge role in, that certainly helps, but even if in an indirect way. And, Devontae Holloman's got a good relationship with Will Muschamp, Gamecock staff, and they're able to talk, and he's able to keep them apprised of how Omega's doing, on the field and in the classroom, and they can pick his brain, as they typically do with any high school coach, about, hey, how's he progressing? What do you like? What are some areas he needs to improve in? and he's able to keep them up to date on all those things, and they have a good relationship where there's trust and honesty there. And so I think all that certainly helped.
Wes, obviously listed as an athlete. I think he's played a little defensive back and a little wide receiver, is expected to come in and play wide receiver at Carolina. But what's the extent of his versatility? Is he someone that Carolina foresees being like a real multi-tool Omar Infante kind of player where he's just going to do a million things like Debo or like Farrow, or is he more of a pure wide receiver?
Well, I think he's listed as an athlete because of the fact that he's someone who could play and that South Carolina likes both as a receiver and a defensive back. I don't necessarily see him maybe being that Debo guy as far as how you use him on offense. I think there's maybe some other guys that fit that a little bit better, but I think he's someone certainly that it's a scenario where if it didn't work out at wide receiver, which, it sounds like the plan is for him to play receiver and start out there, then certainly he could slide over and play some defensive back. But you watch what he does at South Point, plays some quarterback, plays receiver, plays defensive back, is a big part of the return game. I think even Chris, does he punt as well? I think he actually maybe punts for him too. So he just does a lot at South Point, and I think that's why he gets the athlete tag. And like I said, South Carolina likes him on both sides, but it certainly seems like this is headed towards him starting out at receiver, and they really like him there.
In honor of baseball being back, I guess the players agreeing to the owner's proposal, I felt like it was appropriate to give that Omar Infante shout out. Was that a good one, Wes? I know you're a big Braves fan.
The Infante shout out came out of nowhere. I'll give you that.
I was expecting more of a reaction. That's why I had to bring it up again. I love that dude. He was awesome.
Well, I mean, really, I was in football mindset, and it took me so by surprise that I was having to catalog, go through my head of what you were talking about. But yeah, I'm excited for baseball, man. I'm still, like I said on y'all's show yesterday, I'm still a little bit in disbelief. I have to see them on the field before I'm actually going to believe it. But it seems like everybody has agreed, and now we have to hope that there's not some what happens if there's a major outbreak, what's the protocol for if half a team gets COVID? I don't know. So I'm just hoping with the 60-game season that we get this thing in, and the Braves are definitely going to the World Series because I have a pact that if the Braves go, that me and a group of guys are going to the World Series.
Oh, nice.
So it would certainly be the year that no fans can be there.
Yeah, I know, right? That's exactly how that would work out. Maybe you can just get some cool, Atlanta Braves masks and, socially distance in the stands and wear the mask and gloves and be safe. But, I don't know. If you're a baseball fan, you're definitely crossing your fingers. But it looks pretty good right now. But anyway, I just wanted to get a little Brave shout-out in there. Chris, one more thing on O'Mega Blake. I'm always interested when guys are recruited as athletes or have a couple different positions, whether it's DB and wide receiver. Some guys that'll play on both sides of the line or whatever it may be. Do you know how much Omega's desire to play wide receiver played in the recruitment and some of these other places that have offered him? Were they recruiting him as a defensive back, or is it just a matter of do what you can to get him in?
Well, I think a lot of guys like Omega, they look at it if they're not strictly a DB or that sort of definitely 100%, it's pretty obvious that that's their brightest future. Some of them look at it and say sort of whatever's best. And that Omega told us multiple times that really he would be fine with either side of the ball. He didn't even say, hey, I like the idea of the ball in my hands, but I'm open to DB, or I like DB too. It's really, it does not matter to me, is what he pretty consistently told us. So, you look at some like Kentucky, for instance, had him on the board strictly as a defensive back, and they've had some success with bigger, those longer-limbed sort of defensive backs, and Omega has that size at 6'2". Will Muschamp, had him frequently told Omega he was on the board as an athlete. Now, Muschamp, I'm sure, as a defensive coach, looks at him with that sort of defensive eye and thinks about him a lot in terms of the potential as a defensive back. But also, I do know that the staff, including Muschamp, really thinks highly of his game as a receiver too. And I honestly expect that he'll start his career as a receiver. And I think, talking with Devontae Hallman the other day, he mentioned the same thing, in that, he had some things that he really did well at receiver, just some natural things that he did, to where he felt like he would also begin. He also felt like Omega would begin his career there. But there's no doubt that, he has the skill set, I think, and some of the athletic traits and the competitiveness that you look for in the defensive back. I've been on record, and maybe this will end up being another wrong prediction on my part, but I've always liked his potential a little bit more as a defensive back. Not to say he cannot be a quality wide receiver, but I've just liked him because of that, because of that length. I just feel like he may have a little bit of a higher upside there. But again, I think he'll start out as a receiver at South Carolina and just see where it goes from there.
Yeah, 6'2", and I think that's like the low end of what Will Muschamp will allow for defensive backs. It's amazing. Like I'm sure there's one, and I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but it just seems like he hasn't brought in a defensive back that was shorter than 6'2" in several years. One more quick thing, and this is just a random curiosity that arose. Did Devontae remember you, Chris, and you, Wes, when y'all talked to him?
I'm sure. We didn't talk about that. I think so, because we've kept in touch.
Yeah.
Over the years. But that did strike me the other day when I was talking to Devontae, and that, man, this is sort of crazy. Like, I'm getting older and and all that, because I remember when, because Devontae was, of course, committed to Clemson. Tommy Bowden got fired. He reopened things. South Carolina was immediately on the case with Ellis Johnson. North Carolina made a big push. LSU made a push. Clemson was trying to hang in there. And I still remember interviewing Devontae after he took his official visit to South Carolina, and that came to my mind yesterday. So that was sort of crazy. And he's still a very similar guy, just pretty even keel, and definitely did some really good things at South Carolina, developed into a really good player. And I think he's going to be a really good coach at South Point too. He's got more talent coming up in that crop that he's got over at South Point.
Wes, same question. Any sort of like recognition there? Like, hey, I remember one time you asked me a ridiculous question after practice, or anything like that?
No, I haven't talked to Devontae about Omega. I know Chris had the story with him, but it has been kind of cool. These guys that we followed during recruiting, and then of course during their college careers, starting to see them get to the age where they are, making big impacts. I mean, you look, I got to interview Mo Brown a few weeks back with him, obviously, involved in politics now, and just someone that I had gotten to know during the process and while he was at South Carolina. And then, you see Marcus Lattimore using his platform for good. And, it was fun. I talked to Justin Parker. I know Chris talks to Justin some as well, who is a Clemson guy, and we ran into him a while back at one of South Carolina's camps and just talked about, he's like, y'all used to interview me back in the day, and now he's a head coach at the high school level. So it's kind of funny. A lot of these guys, even if you don't stay in touch, and even if they don't remember you specifically, I think they obviously, like a guy like Devontae Holloman, he remembers Gamecocks Central in general, I'm sure, and at least has some, memory of being interviewed, even if there's not the specifics, I guess.
Yeah, and it's to Justin, that was funny, because we were able to sort of give him grief about never answering his phone towards the end of the process, because man, he sort of shut things down, and we were laughing about that. But there's also been, there's been some guys make impact at the college level. You look at Cliff Matthews is the D-line coach at Limestone. You got Travian Robertson at Georgia State. Another guy who, we kind of covered, didn't end up going to South Carolina, but Daquan Bowers, I think, is the D-line coach for Jeff Scott at South Florida now. So, there's a bunch of guys that are, that we covered back in the day that are, whether it's high school or college level, making a significant impact, whether it's coaching or some of the off-field type stuff that Wes mentioned.
Yeah, Bryson Allen Williams is a grad assistant at Georgia State now.
That's right.
Casey Crosby just got hired as an assistant at Oceanside High School down near the beach. So, yeah, a lot of these guys are, Perry Orth doing his quarterback development business. Jacob August actually just got involved in doing that with some skill guys with receivers and tight ends. So, I think now Corey Boyd was a little before my time, but I think he's got, a company where he's developing high school players as well.
They grow up so fast, don't they, guys?
They do.
Yeah.
They do. Yeah.
Wow, that's really cool. All right, I wanted to ask you one more thing, and I was going to save this for the end, but you mentioned it, Wes, and I don't want to get too far removed from this observation because I think this is important because a lot of Carolina fans have been complaining that South Carolina has so many commitments from 3-star guys, not enough 4-star guys, no 5-star guys, obviously, at this point. And, again, we've talked so much about what this means, how many decommits we expect to get once players can actually go make official visits and go back to college campuses and start to, I guess, involve themselves a little bit more in that process. So none of this is, by any means, anywhere close to set in stone. It's less set in stone than it normally is even around this time of year, which is already not that set in stone. With that, also, you have Carolina that just went 4-8 with a lot of uncertainty on the coaching staff in terms of the future of the program stability, and things like that. So the fact that Carolina's already gotten this many guys and a couple of 4-star guys is probably better than you can expect from most schools that just went 4-8 last year and have a relatively uncertain future. But that being said, I just wanted to ask so that we can address it, because one thing that you mentioned with Omega is I think interesting, because you look at his offer list, and it's South Carolina, and then it's some places like Appalachian State, and it's East Carolina, and you have Kentucky and Ole Miss, and Michigan State. I think showed some interest in him. Tennessee, North Carolina State. So you have some of those programs. But when you mentioned that Clemson and Alabama and programs like that are sniffing around, I think that immediately validates a player. Now, some people would push back and say, well, hey, they were sniffing around and there was something they didn't like because, they didn't offer the kid. But at this point, again, it's so early in the evaluations. So, Wes, just speak to those people that have been super negative about that. And look, if you are, maybe you're right. You have every right to, feel however you feel about it. But it is just, it's interesting, and because it's such an inexact science, and even, I'm someone that normally doesn't look at stars and instead will look at, offers and what other schools were interested. But, what does Alabama and Clemson sniffing around Omega Blake mean relative to actually having offers from places like Michigan State and Ole Miss?
Yeah, well, I think to just mention App State first, we're probably misrepresenting how impressive of an offer list he actually does have. He's got 30-plus offers, like you said, Tennessee, Kentucky, Louisville and Virginia Tech were the other two finalists, Ole Miss, like you said, Michigan State. There's a number of other Power 5 schools in the mix there. So, it's not like Omega has a bad offer list. And I think, Alabama, Clemson, Georgia, they're able to be as selective as anyone in the country right now. And I think certainly the fact that, again, South Carolina was sort of sold here as a player on Omega, but they were waiting on, to get more academic information. And if you're one of those three schools we're talking about, if there's any potential strikes, as far as an evaluation, you don't have to offer. You just move on to the next guy. And, we don't know if he wouldn't have gotten an offer from those guys if time had just sort of passed a little bit and they had continued watching him, continued gathering information. Who knows what would have happened in a couple of months. But, certainly I do think that there was interest there. There was even some talk that Clemson was sort of trying to hold Omega Blake off, and sort of, hey, we're going to offer, we're probably going to offer, just hang tight, as they got more information on him. Obviously, he decided not to wait and to go ahead and commit, so that didn't happen. But, yeah, I do think it speaks to his ability as a player.
Chris, what should fans' concern level be at this point? Again, given all the uncertainty, and like I said, given the fact that they just went 4-8, like this is like a probably pretty reasonable thing to expect in terms of the number and the quantity and quality of guys that are committed to South Carolina right now.
Yeah, I think I honestly separate those things between, concern and how you assess the class. It's okay to be concerned because, look, going into this season, it is concerning. We knew, again, going into this class, we knew, or we tried to tell people, it doesn't mean you got to accept it or be okay with it, but we tried to tell people this is not going to be a heavy star power class. There's not going to be 2 5-stars in this class. There's just not. There's not a 5-star guy in state. There's not a guy where, almost a rabbit out of a hat situation with Marshawn Lloyd. But, so it went from sort of maybe the most quality class that Will Muschamp brought in. Time will tell, but that's what it looks like on paper. And then the season doesn't go well and all those different things. So concern is completely fine. And if you look at the class and say, well, I don't like the 3 stars or whatever, that's okay. I mean, it's fine to think that. But I think you do have to be realistic with it in that the team went 4-8. Coaching staff was placed on the hot seat, had to deal with all that. And you go into the season needing to improve for sure. And so it's a big year from that standpoint. You still have a chance to stabilize things, but there's a ways to go in recruiting, but you think about those things and the fact that you didn't have a spring eval period and you didn't have summer camps and it wasn't projected to be as big of a class momentum wise in terms of star power. I think that makes it understandable. So I think it's okay to be concerned, but you can also recognize that it does look like there are still some good players in this class.
Mm-hmm.
Is it an amazing one top to bottom? I mean, I don't think you could look at that and say it's some elite class right now, but there's a ways to go. And I think there's some good pickups, especially in the circumstances. But what you do have to recognize is it's very important for South Carolina to have a quality season this year. What's your definition of that? It can depend, but they got to at least get to a bowl, I think, to stabilize things. And then from there, maybe if you go and you have a good season, maybe recruiting reopens and maybe you're able to get back in on some big time guys or stay in with some of these big time guys that they're still in it for and go out and, sign more star power. I think it's just to be determined, but you can look at it, I think, with a moderate stance. I think that's okay to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, man, I think like you said, that's sort of the right way to look at it. If you're disappointed that there aren't more 5-stars in there, that's probably okay, but I just don't think it's realistic to think that should necessarily be the case. But I think it's completely reasonable, I guess, for the fan base to want the program to be better and more stable and have more guys, but that's just not where it is right now. GamecockCentral.com is where you can find all the interviews, updates on all these guys, and a couple more that we're going to talk about in just a second. So subscribe to GamecockCentral.com. Subscribe to the GamecockCentral.com newsletter because that thing is packed full of information, and it comes free in your email inbox every single morning, and it's just, it's no fluff. It's just chock full of information. It's great. Honestly, I use that a lot in my show prep every day because it keeps me abreast of everything happening in Gamecock Nation, especially as football season is closer and closer to getting underway and recruiting is as lively as ever. And also, subscribe to the Gamecock Central Podcast and Network. That's what you're listening to right now. It gives us a platform to delve a little bit more into it and to have random tangents about Omar Infante and whatever else we feel like distracting ourselves with on any given Wednesday. Before we get out of here, I want to talk about 2 more guys that we are expecting to hear something from at some point, 2 other guys that are on Carolina's radar. I'll split it up, and I will let you start, Wes, and give the latest on Jordan Poole.
Yeah, a kid out of North Carolina, one of South Carolina's top linebacker targets, and recently put out his top 3, South Carolina, NC State, Virginia Tech, and just an outstanding athlete, somebody South Carolina had in camp last year, offered at the time. They've stayed in touch with him, I would say, for the entire year, but really I think started to gain some steam with him the last few months. Kyle Krantz is very involved there. Des Kitchings had some connection to that school. So once he came in, I think that gave South Carolina a little bit of a boost. And Rod Wilson, obviously, is the linebackers coach, very involved too. I don't have a feel yet for which way this one's heading. Chris and I are digging on it to give everybody, try to give everybody a little bit better feel for what's going to happen there. But a commitment could be coming, as soon as the 1st of July. So, someone that I think is definitely worth paying attention to and tracking right now.
The other guy that I think Carolina fans are curious about is Keon Coleman. What's the latest with him, Chris?
Yeah, so Keon's a guy that, South Carolina's remained in the game with. He's taken a little bit of a slower approach to recruiting, although he did just narrow his list. South Carolina made that cut. Oklahoma made that cut, and Kansas did. And so I think you look at those schools, and it's an interesting mix, right? South Carolina, I think, has done a fantastic job of recruiting, and Brian McClendon started it. Joe Cox has really been on Coleman hard and building a really good relationship with him, as is Will Muschamp personally. You know, you look at Oklahoma, and they've had a lot of success, obviously, with receivers. Most big-time receivers coming out, especially guys a little bit more out that way, are going to at least have Oklahoma, you know, maybe not in their top 3, top 5, but they're going to be, you know, capturing their attention. I think a lot of people look at Kansas and say, what the heck? But, you know, you remember the Les Miles tie, Les Miles at LSU, and, you know, Keon Coleman being from Louisiana. So this is a big athletic kid that South Carolina has really liked as a receiver prospect. He's got a lot of upside, a lot of potential. And so they've been recruiting him pretty hard. You know, spots obviously at receiver are getting tighter, and there's still a lot of guys on the board. But this one has the feel, I think, Pearson, of a guy that, if I had to guess, that they'd probably go the distance with. Mm-hmm. Seems like they really like him. And although he's taken a slower approach, you know, he did sort of narrow that list down. I'd imagine he may keep things open, if, you know, to some new offers. But it'll be interesting to see if he commits early without, you know, the benefit of taking more visits, or some visits in general, or if he'll, you know, try to wait things out and see whenever in-person recruiting reopens. That's certainly a question that a lot of prospects are dealing with right now.
So by the time we record this time next week, we may not have an official word on either one of those guys, but whenever it does happen, Gamecock Central will have it. And just as a small teaser here, because this is a curiosity that I have, and I was going to ask you guys about today, but we're just about out of time, and I figured it might be better spent next week when we don't have as many guys, probably, to talk about, although who knows. I wasn't expecting to have 3 commitments to talk about when we recorded this time last week. But committable offers, again, don't answer this now, but just be thinking about how best to explain this, because I think this confuses a lot of people in terms of what is not a committable offer, what it means for the school, what it means for the player. I think just like the actual bare bones of what it is, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, but what the implications of committable and non-committable offers are, I think is sort of another piece as people start to unpack exactly, you know, what these commitments and what these recruiting classes and how to, I don't know, just how to parse this in a time of even more uncertainty than we normally have in an already uncertain business. But Wes and Chris, great stuff as always. Thank you all so much for listening. Again, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the Gamecock Central Podcast Network, and we will talk to you next week.